wanted to let you know that I'm having some problems with my sound, so I hope that it will share fine. But in case it doesn't work, just let me know. So yeah, I just don't play silence. So yes, thank you for the introduction and for giving me the possibility to present in this forum, and really thank you to all the wonderful speakers that presented in the last 2 days and also in the actual conference in Vipiteno. Now for the last talk of the conference, I hope that you will enjoy hearing about some examples of Rimsky-Korsakov operatic works, specifically looking at his interest in non-diatonic techniques and symmetrical cycles. Now, my research is mostly analytical in nature, and as such, the latter half of the presentation will consist of musical example, while the first half will present the scholarly and analytical context on the topic. Now, as is well known, Rimsky made significant use in his works on non-diatonic techniques along cycles of both major and minor thirds. Now, this was not specific to him, but rather reflected a Russian interest in third cycles, particularly in the portrayal of the supernatural, starting from Glinka's Ruslan and Lyudmila and through to Darvinsky, The Stone Guest, which was a work that actually Rimsky was very familiar with as he orchestrated it after the composer's death. Going through the Kuchka's work and arriving to Stravinsky, Russian music was characterized by an exploration of the possibilities offered by third-related music. Now, clearly, this was not something that originated in Russia, but for example, in Rimsky's case, his Russian heritage was not the only source. For example, he was very familiar with Liszt's work, and specifically symphonic poems, that inspired him to expand on his compositional palette and, for example, reach the octatonic scale. Now, as we all know, we are very lucky that Rimsky left his famous musical autobiography that, although was at times incorrect or partial in his recounting of history, provides an invaluable resource into the composer's musical life. In it, Rimsky relates how he quote, discovered the tone semitone scale or the octatonic scale through Liszt's Mountain Symphonic poem. Now, this discovery led him to develop this harmonic tool to such an extent that in Russia, and here my Russian colleagues will definitely know better than me, the scale is still known as the Rimsky-Korsakov scale. Now, as part of his work at the St. Petersburg Conservatoire, where he taught from 1871, Rimsky produced the Practical Manual of Harmony. This textbook was intended for conservatoire students and covers several areas, started from very basic notions, reaching more complex issues. So it was sort of, was supposed to be used as a compendium of harmonic theory that was to use for the students. Now, Rimsky felt compelled to write a harmony manual as he was left unsatisfied with those currently available to Russian students, including Tchaikovsky's. However, it's important to note that he asked for Tchaikovsky's opinion, and he was also deeply respectful and felt in debt to his colleagues' endeavor. Now, in the last chapter, Rimsky discusses what he calls false progressions along cycles of both major and minor thirds, and these are illustrated in the example. The top stave presents the progression along the cycle of major thirds, so starting from C to A flat to E, and then going back to C, and it is presented with both major and minor triads. On the bottom stave, we find a similar progression along the cycle of minor thirds. So again, starting from C, moving to E, to F sharp, to E flat, and then back to C, again with both major and minor triads. Now, the fact that these two progressions are presented at the same time within the harmony manual demonstrates how Rimsky thought of them as part of a unified framework, expanding the possibilities offered by fifth relations, rather than as separate spaces that do not have the potential to be used in conjunction. This is particularly relevant because in the context of scholarship on Rimsky's harmony, the role of octatonicism has been much more heavily emphasized. Starting with Taraskin's work in the 1980s, Rimsky's use, knowledge, and development of octatonicism has been the focus of a significant study, and also sort of sparked a major debate in musicology, which was exemplified in an issue of Music Theory Spectrum in 2011 that featured a symposium discussing the topic, with scholars on both sides of the Atlantic contributing opposing views. However, the majority of these studies mostly focused on Rimsky as a way to reflect on Stravinsky's work, and therefore criticize his work with this sort of forward-looking attitude. They also concentrated almost exclusively on octatonic practices, so on his exploitation of minor third cycles and on the role of the diminished seventh. However, Rimsky made significant use of hexatonic techniques as well, in particularly employing the augmented triad in different contexts. Now, he was not alone in this, as the use of the augmented triad was quite widespread in Russian music and was also characteristic of Liszt's work. However, Rimsky used the augmented triad not only as a chromatic alteration in a diatonic context, but also in hexatonic and whole tone contexts. Now, scholarship on Rimsky's hexatonicism is still rather sparse, as apart from a mention in Cohn's 2012 Audacious Euphony, where he explored it in the entire suite, there's only, as far as I am aware, one significant contribution that came in 2012, which was an article by Philip Ewell that provided a much more thorough exploration of Rimsky's hexatonicism. In the article, Ewell identified 3 types of hexatonicism in 6 of Rimsky's operas, these being the hexatonic scale, the hexatonic pole, and a false progression along major third cycles, such as the one we just saw. Now, in the remaining of the presentation, I will offer examples from 2 different operas, The Tale of Tsar Sultan of 1900 and Kashi the Deathless of 1902, that illustrate the blending of non-diatonic spaces that characterized Rimsky's work, particularly in the representation of the supernatural. These examples are just a snapshot of Rimsky's varied use of chords and chord progressions, but they show how the composer was consciously aware of the possibilities offered by these spaces. So I will play this example. It should be just a bit over a minute long.
Marta, there's no sound.
Yeah, I apologize for that. That is something that I was trying to fix before my turn came for the presentation. So I think that, yeah, unfortunately, I'm not able to play the music, which is a shame because it's very nice music. I hope that maybe you will have the opportunity to go and listen to it maybe later on in your own time. So clearly, it doesn't have the same effect as hearing it. But anyway, I will now discuss it. So this example comes from the second act, and it features that material that was previously analyzed in the literature, but never in conjunction, as different sources focused on either the octatonic aspect, and this came from Taraskin 1985 article, or the hexatonic, and this came from Ewell in 2020. So the example is a reduction of the passage in question that, as I said, is known from the second act, where the protagonist, Prince Guidom, and his mother encounter the magical swan princess who is trapped by a kite. which will reveal itself to be the evil sorcerer, sort of one of the main antagonists in the opera. The shrieks of the swan articulate three hexatonic poles within the Eastern system, which are marked by an H in the score, and present the complete hexatonic collection. And this was something that you all recognized. However, if we look further into the passage, we can see that another hexatonic pole is introduced, and this one is from the Southern system, so C sharp minor to F7, and a gradual shift from hexatonic to octatonic happens. And this is done using C sharp minor as a pivot. So C sharp minor is firstly introduced in a hexatonic context, so as part of the hexatonic pole with F7. However, rather than continuing with the progression that Rimsky established, so hexatonic pole L transformation, Rimsky uses C sharp minor to modulate to an octatonic progression, constructing a diminished seventh on it. So the diminished seventh that appears in the bar afterwards, so C sharp, E, G, B flat, is introduced and is then used to punctuate the minor third related triads. So firstly on C sharp minor, then B flat minor, G minor, and eventually E minor, extending the progression. Subsequently, Rimsky presents the two forms of the octatonic scale, starting with respectively the semitone and the tone on E. Now, the first scale is sustained by the same G, B flat, C sharp, E diminished seventh that we were firstly introduced to, and it represents the 0-1 collection. And the second scale, so the one beginning with the tone, is sustained by the F, G sharp, B, D diminished seventh, and it represents a second octatonic collection, the 1-2 collection. Now, this passage is remarkable, not only because it further illustrates the blend of hexatonic and octatonic procedures, but because it demonstrates that the composer was well aware of the existence of the two forms of the octatonic scale. Richard Taraskin even presented a sketch for this passage with Rimsky's own writing, where the composer termed the scales the one scale and the other scale, thus acknowledging their difference. As such, Ewell's and Taraskin's contribution recognized the significance of this passage through very different lenses, hexatonic the former and octatonic the latter. While both authors provide extremely significant evidence for the sophisticated nature of Rimsky's harmonic practices, bringing together these contributions and understanding them as part of a more comprehensive framework lends them even more reach. Not only was Rimsky involved with the study of octatonic minor third cycles, as has been the subject of a 3-decade-long debate, and not only was he also, if not equally, at least significantly interested by the possibilities of major third-related cycles, as recently demonstrated by Ewell, he used these various possibilities in conjunction, thus enjoying a more complex compositional palette. Combining these perspectives, by understanding all of his non-diatonic language as part of a unified framework, appears as the most rewarding choice. Rather than discretely separated worlds requiring a shift in listening of the kind proposed by Lerder, for example, in order to be traversed, Rimsky's harmonic language presents a fluid vocabulary which he drew on depending on the sonorous and modulatory needs of each passage. Not moving through spaces, but moving in the same space through different means seems to be a formula that better represents the kind of harmonic language that we have encountered. Now, in Rimsky's operas, we can find examples where the augmented triads are located in numerous contexts, as I briefly mentioned before, including hexatonic, for example, as part of the augmented hexatonic pole, and also in chromatic context, where augmented triads are used as substitute for major dominants following a rather conventional technique. However, augmented triads are also a part of the whole tone soundscape and are thus used in this context by Rimsky. Now, while Sultan features significant hexatonic sections, and this is something that, as I say, was only mentioned in more depth by you all recently, Cache the Deathless has been, since Taraskin's articles, the focus of study because it features quite heavily the dark world of diminished seventh, tritons, and minor third relations, which are really ubiquitous throughout the whole opera. In his autobiography, Rimsky acknowledged how in this opera he featured, quote, some new harmonic devices that had heretofore not existed in my repertory as a composer, end quote, which included false relations formed by progressions of major thirds. In the same discussion, he also mentions how he, quote, succeeded in plotting the snowstorm scene almost entirely on the sustained diminished chord of the seventh, end quote. Now, this opera opens with a chromatic motif that will be one of its main leitmotifs throughout, which is followed by a series of descending major third intervals. And again, I apologize for the lack of sound. And it culminates with an augmented triad. Now, these intervals form a whole tone scale divided into two tetrachords, which are highlighted in the example, respectively in bar 5 and 6. These two tetrachords are then repeated an octave lower and unsustained by the F sharp C triton, which is a ubiquitous triton in the opera. Because of the major thirds intervals formation of the sequence, we find G flat F sharp enharmonicism, which is another technique that is characteristic of the opera. It is actually Rimsky in the Practical Manual of Harmony puts into dialogue with his false progressions. So using enharmonicism and false progressions as a way to expand his compositional palette. Now, the arrival of the augmented triad is an exact replica of one of the examples presented by Rimsky in the Practical Manual of Harmony, where he explored different ways of creating and resolving both augmented triads and diminished seventh, which again shows us how he considered these two chord formations as part of a unified whole. In this case, it is a major third with an added raised fifth. The resolution of this chord is also specular to the one presented in the harmony manual, as C augmented resolves to A minor by a smooth movement. And this is another one of the characteristics of the third related cycles that Rimsky talks about, the kind of smooth movement that they allows, and the fact that they also allow the connection of chords or of keys that are conventionally rather far away from each other, but that are, on the other hand, able to be traversed rather quickly, rather than moving in fifths, reading in thirds, or exploiting the sort of minimal semitonal displacement that is allowed by this kind of movement. Now, the progression will recur a few bars later, this time as a rising sequence, which however maintains the same structure. So it's major third intervals divided in tetrachords on the other whole tone scale, and it culminates on B augmented. Again, enharmonicism is present through the D sharp E flat, and also the augmented triad is arrived at through enharmonic means, as E flat G is held over and becomes D sharp F double sharp with the B at the bottom. So unlike the previous example, this augmented triad is not created with an added raised fifth, but rather with a lowered root, the second method presented by Rimsky in the Practical Manual of Harmony. And again, the augmented triad resolves following Rimsky's directives to G sharp minor. Sorry, there's an error. This is supposed to be G sharp. So the mention of the practical manual of harmony in this context serves to show how Rimsky views his non-diatonic compositional tools as complementary to more traditional ones, so that he instructed pupils in their usage. As such, his more adventurous musical flights are surely remarkable, but should be understood in the context of his constant adherence to strict modulatory plans, and as he remarked in one of his letters, to the quote, invisible presence of the tonic at all times, unquote. Now, Rimsky viewed his musical universe as a unified, albeit varied cosmos, systematically and meticulously organized, but not without its flight of fancy. Now, unfortunately, we reached the conclusion rather early, as I was hoping to play more musical examples, which, yeah, however, I really apologize for the lack of those. So I hope that throughout the course of this presentation, the examples help to illustrate some of the characteristics of Rimsky's harmonic thinking. And while they offer an innovative perspective on the composer's methods, they also confirm some of the previous assumptions. Now, Rimsky non-diatonic practices have been partly recontextualized in a more comprehensive framework that conjugates the hexatonic and the octatonic within a unified whole. The present paper aimed at laying the foundations for a framework that, while developed through the analysis of Rimsky's work, will be generalizable for similar repertoire. And this discussion has also highlighted the richness of Rimsky's harmonic language, confirming it as suitable terrain for furthering understanding of late 19th century harmony. Rimsky's harmonic thinking, expressed through the practical manual of harmony, his remarks on his compositions, and the compositions themselves, offered the sketch of a complex picture where tonal preoccupation intersected his fascination for third cycles and his quest for evolving harmonic means. So just a few references, and yes, thank you very much for listening.
All right, let's take in some questions. Could I ask? I guess I'll ask the first one. The last point in your conclusion was that Rimsky-Korsakov's music might allow us to develop new analytical tools for this repertoire, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on this idea of new analytical tools.
Yeah, absolutely. This is actually something that regrettably I decided to leave out of the presentation because I was going to play the examples, which is something I've been working on recently. And I've been working mainly in through the use of Neo-Riemannian theory, so the idea of transformation and the sort of smooth movement. And Neo-Riemannian theory is great for looking at late 19th century repertoire, and it's one of its main focus. However, the transformation themselves do not allow for mapping of movement between chords that are not consonant triads. So all the main transformation, P, R, L, etc., H, etc., are only to be used between consonant triads. So because of the relevance and presence of, for example, the augmented triad and also of seventh, so diminished seventh, half diminished seventh, etc. I've been trying to find ways to include those within a transformational framework. And one of the ways I approached that was through the idea of simultaneous transformation. So yeah, and I really regret not including that in the presentation, but so applying two transformations to a chord at the same time allows for mapping between, for example, major or minor triads, consonant triads, and augmented ones, also diminished triads, and also quartal chords. So it really expands the possibilities offered by transformational theory, which, I mean, it's great in mapping this kind of movement, but does not include on the surface this kind of triad, because, for example, in Weizmann regions, the augmented triad is always there as a sort of background sonority. However, when it comes to actually map it out, it's not usually included. So one of the things is this idea of simultaneous transformation, where, for example, L and P are applied to a triad at the same time. So two pitches are displaced just by a semitone, resulting in an augmented one. Or R and P are applied at the same time, resulting in a diminished one, etc. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. I should have included it.
Great, thanks. Other comments or questions?
On that note, can you hear me? Yes, okay, good. On that note, Marta, I wonder if you've looked at some of Richard Cohn's chapters on audacious euphony, which create these kind of spaces, these geometric spaces of, I guess, hexatonic pools or something that are linked by precisely augmented triads or diminished seventh chords in this kind of clock face diagram. I wonder if you've looked at those in terms of mapping out transformations kind of spatially and progressionally through one of Rimsky-Korsakov's pieces.
Yeah, that was actually one of the first approaches that I used when I started analyzing Rimsky's work, exactly the clock diagram that you were referencing it. And I think those are very valid instruments in mapping this kind of harmonic progressions. But I still felt that they sort of put the augmented triad on a different plane compared to consonant one. So there are the consonant triads, and then the augmented triad that has this special status, as you said, as connecting different hexatonic collection of different Weizmann regions. However, is not seamlessly included within transformational theory. So this is one of the main reasons why I tried to find other ways at arriving to basically the same kind of thing. So mapping this kind of movement, but putting the augmented triad as we're on the same plane as consonant triad rather than as a separate entity. I hope that answers.
All right. Any other comments or questions?